Order, and welcome to today's session of the Transport Select Committee, where we continue our pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft rail reform bill. Before we get into questions, could I invite both our witnesses just to state your names and organisations, please, for our records. Mr. Lynch first.
Yeah, I'm Mick Lynch. I'm the General Secretary of the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Mick Whelan. I'm the General Secretary of the Train Drivers Union, ASLEF.
Thank you, and we're grateful to both of you for your time this afternoon. If I can start off with a fairly general question, if I may. You both represent the interests of a large proportion of the employees who operate and maintain the railway. Very briefly, do you think the provisions of the draft bill will be welcomed by your members? Mr. Whelan, start with you.
Thank you. Well, we welcome the wheels and steel coming back together. We think that's the first thing. We've seen the 23 years of privatisation, the fragmentation of the railway has led to less productivity, much duplication, and different standards for workers across the whole industry. We've seen an awful lot of insourcing, we've seen an awful lot of problems which have led to periods of industrial strife. So, overarchingly, we think anything that moves in the right direction is the right thing to do.
Thank you.
No, we don't really welcome it. From our point of view, it doesn't solve the major problems on the railway, the way it's structured, the fragmentation. It wouldn't address the issues that has been causing the sustained industrial action. And we think it's a bit of a rearrangement of deck chairs on a vessel that's doomed because privatisation is a failure. And virtually everyone in the country recognises that. And we've got to move to a situation where we get rid of the privateers. And this secures their position to some extent within the industry, and we don't think that's appropriate.
Thank you. Now, as you've alluded to, there are, how can I put it, a spectrum of ambitions for the future of the rail industry, but our focus is primarily on the draft piece of legislation in front of us. One of the areas of debate we're exploring is the extent to which what has to be on the face of the bill and what can come around the bill. As one of our witnesses said the other week, this is part of a jigsaw of reform in the industry. In terms of that balance about this being a very narrowly defined bill, as opposed to having more detail fleshed out, where would your union sit?
Well, I agree with my colleague that other than on the point of bringing the wheels of steel together, it does very little aspirationally to deal with the cost of within the industry. It does nothing to do with the green agenda extension of it or about how we would get the benefits of any synergies of coming together. What it does do is advocate that we're going to very much have the status quo while increasing open access within the industry. Now, without the increase of the capacity, where are these open access trains going to come from, where they're going to run to and from, and will they replace the existing trains as an alternative is quite interesting for us. And when we look at the core costs of the industry, of course, we've seen that the profits of the rolling stock operators went up by 41% last year. There's nothing within the bill that stops the industry being hostage to fortune to the leasing companies going forward. And actually, much of it does enshrine their right to actually procure cheaper and keep maintaining the levels of cost to the industry which we feel are untenable, which could have been dealt with under a different model.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we do welcome the idea of an integrated rail body, which we assume is going to be called Great British Rail. Everybody's saying that. So we welcome that there's going to be a body that is the railway to some extent, and, you know, saying British Rail is boo-hoo round here, but somebody will have to be accountable for operating the railway. We fear that the Secretary of State will still be able to interfere. We would like a body that is truly independent, but is accountable to this Parliament, in the sense that Parliament should set the ambitions, whether that's rail operations itself, fares levels, integration and climate targets. That should be a government ambition, and then the body should get on with delivering that. But we do feel that it underpins and wires in again the prejudice against public sector operators. It will still be illegal, as far as we understand it, to have public sector rail operators in the sector, and that is just an ideological attitude that is a fault with the bill, because it's going to say to the independent body that you will have to promote private operation, and we think that promotion of private interest, whether it's rolling stock, whether it's the operation of trains, or whether it's subcontracted on the infrastructure, is one of the problems of fragmentation that we've all been trying to deal with for the last 30 years. So even though it's got a narrow focus, it's focused in the wrong direction as far as we're concerned.
Thank you, and my colleagues will want to probe some of those points further in a moment. I'd just like to conclude my first round of questions with a further issue that we've picked up in the evidence, and that is the sort of vehicle, legal entity vehicle for the IRB is the Network Rail body. Now, some witnesses have expressed concern that this means it will become Network Rail 2.0, whereas the point of the IRB is to not just have the interests of the infrastructure, but of the operations as well. Are you comfortable with the Network Rail infrastructure becoming the legal entity that the IRB will become?
In our evidence we submitted, no. We believe that you shouldn't be the licensee and the guiding mind. We believe that's fraught with all sorts of dangers and will repeat the mistakes of the past. I think looking at the bill itself, when you look at accountability, we have to have an annual report on how the growth of the private sector, but we don't have an annual report on the growth of anything else. We're already telling the guiding mind what their outputs and outcomes are going to be, and of course there are other parts of the bill that says the Minister of State can vary the needs or requests at 28 days notice. We don't see any underpinning scrutiny of those requests, how they're developed, or where there's any opinions of the stakeholders, whether it be the employees, the other stakeholders or anybody else in those decisions.
Again, these are important points which we'll cover, but I was trying to get to the using Network Rail Infrastructure Limited as the legal entity of the IRB for the purposes of trooping staff over. Is that a concern, or are you?
It is a concern.
Yeah, it is.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we don't think it's optimal. I think Network Rail's got enough to do, and there should be somebody in charge of the infrastructure in the new railway. I don't think Network Rail should be imperialistic. They should be subject to the independent body, but so should the people operate in the passenger service, and so should the people operate in the freight section of the railway, which is often forgotten in all these discussions. So those entities should be in one operation and one entity, which will be a new entity, not a derivative of an old structure.
Thank you. Fabian.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. To an extent, Mick Lynch, you've already answered part of my question, which was going to be, is it important that the IRB, once established, operates independently from government? But can you tell us why you think it needs to be independent?
Well, we've just been through it. We've had a succession of transport ministers who haven't been very interested in the job, to be honest. I think the current one is more interested, to be fair. We don't agree, but he's stuck at it at least, and so has the rail minister. But I do believe that there should be an accountable board and body that is running the railway. I think that's what the public want. They want to know this is the top railway person. These are the people with the sub-responsibilities, infrastructure, passenger, freight, etc., whatever we need. And that person should be the public face. They should be accountable for it, same as many other public bodies have. I mean, there is somebody that's responsible for the BBC. They come in here regularly, and they're accountable for what they do. There's lots of other structures on there. And the Secretary of State should be putting placing demands on that body, and we'll work out how that is. And then they should be giving their reports to this, to the Parliament on what they've achieved, and that should be part of a process. But they should be allowed to get on with the business and the actuality of running the railway, and accountable for what they've done with their business, their corporation, whatever we end up calling it. I think that's a genuine division of responsibility, but with proper accountability. This is what I do, and this is what I'm responsible for. That's what you do, and you've got the justified right to make those demands on my corporation and on me as the chair or chief exec or whatever it is. I think that's a good division of responsibility.
Do you agree with that, Mick, Whelan?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think we've given evidence before about how we believe there should be a 30-year plan and a guiding mind, and people should be measured against that guiding plan. And if you are the guiding mind with the vision, are you altering the vision to the circumstances you're working within, I don't quite think that's quite objective, and doesn't allow you then to make the financial demands you might require or the changes you might require on the delivery of that plan.
But just to follow up, we think this bill has too much interference with the Secretary of State, where they will create the passenger franchises. The DFT will do that. The Secretary of State will have direct intervention. But then this new body will have to take up the design that's been given to them and imposed on them. So that's where a division should be. A politician, with great respect, shouldn't be saying, I want the passenger service in this area or on this route or in that nation, importantly, to look exactly like this, and I'm going to impose that on the body. That should be for the railway to work out with the consultation with passenger groups, the environmentalists, whoever we need to talk to.
How do we find then the right balance between that accountability, between elected representatives having oversight, as we've said, of the IRB, whilst maintaining its operational independence? Because, you know, how would you make this reflect in the legislation that's being put forward? And furthermore, perhaps you could both give us your view on this. I think I could probably predict what it is. Should there be representatives of the workforce on the integrated rail body?
As long as it's not us two.
Well, we thought of you first.
No. Quite obviously, we believe there should be representatives of all stakeholders, even from the supply chain to everybody else, in what we do in future. What we've seen recently, particularly over decision of HS2 and a change of the guiding mind into what should have been arbitrarily, once you made a plan, to stick by it, doesn't just affect the employees in a sector. It affects the supply chains, it affects apprenticeships, it affects so many other areas. So anybody impacted by a decision should have the opportunity to actually question or scrutinise that decision. But ultimately, you need the autonomy of that decision maker not to be challenged either through the Ministry of State or elsewhere. But of course, if you look at this document, it's very much about enshrining the current model without the accountability of fare box or performance at this moment in time that we've had in the past. So how much this bill is about keeping the status quo in a different way, and how much is really about having a railway that's fit for the future?
Yeah, I mean, on worker representation, I mean, from our point of view, in ScotRail we have that, but we don't do that ourselves. Well, I don't think it's appropriate for a direct trade union to do it. We give that to the General Secretary of the TUC between the unions. So that's the kind of worker representation we have. We wouldn't want one of our reps up there in the boardroom getting involved in these kind of arguments, but there should be a voice. But there should also be a voice for the passengers. Transport focus needs to be recast, we think, and make it more democratic. So, I mean, and the taxpayer might have a say, but you might say that's what the politicians are here for, I don't know. But I think you can have a good system, and I think for the Secretary of State, they've got to be accountable for the whole thing. So if the Secretary of State for Transport has carbon emission responsibilities, they've got to say to you as politicians what they've done through the target setting and accountability of the railway to achieve that. Same with road policy and aviation policy and all the rest of it. And that's got to be a coherent. So the railway structure's got to be coherent with an integrated transport policy, which ultimately the Secretary of State is responsible for, and accounts to you as a body to say, these are the targets, this is what I've given to all of these transport sectors, and this is how we've got on according to the timescale and the plan. That's where the democracy and the accountability comes from.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I turn to Paul, I just want to ask a supplementary on that, on where you think the boundaries should lie of the ability of a Secretary of State to intervene. So let me give you a hypothetical example. My constituency is on the West Coast Main Line. There may come a choice to be made between increasing the number of commuter services on that section of the line as opposed to having non-stop intercity services. There will be lobbying from MPs, councils and so on both sides of the argument. Is that an issue you think the Secretary of State should have an ability to intervene on, or should that be left entirely to the IRB?
I think it should be left entirely to the IRB, because what's unclear from this bill, where it talks about coordinated growth, is about how that will work. And when we talk about coordinated growth, we're not just talking about commuter traffic and the intercity traffic, particularly on the West Coast. What we now have the problem is we don't have enough capacity on the West Coast for the existing freight traffic. So the decisions then about coordination have to lie with this body, don't they, to get the best balance. The real problem with that, nothing within this increases capacity or gives the opportunity to increase capacity. So we are very much going to be working within the constraints of the railway system we've currently got.
I appreciate that, but I'm just
yeah, so it should be that decision on the balance. If you are going to talk about coordinated growth, should be across the three sectors.
Do you share that?
Yeah, I think that politicians would be best served not getting tarnished by too much lobbying. But of course, it's still a democracy. You do have the right to have your opinion like everyone else, and I wouldn't want to stop that. But what we do need is a robust consultation process. Many people suspect in all sorts of walks of life that consultation isn't meaningful. That didn't turn out to be true on the stations campaign that we ran last year. That was a very pleasing outcome for us, and we did get listened to. But I think situations like you're talking about, reform of running times or services, has to be a meaningful consultation, and the legislation has to set that up as a really robust part of how GBR, or whatever it's going to be called, is accountable to the people that they serve. And that needs to be really hardwired into any legislation, not just superficial.
Thank you. Paul.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, gentlemen. Just want to go something that was mentioned a few seconds ago, just about the franchise model. I just want to talk a little bit around the specifics of that. My understanding is that, that you're opposed to the franchise model itself, but given that it's likely to happen, what would you like to see changed on the face of the bill in the terms of how the IRB will actually exercise the franchising powers? Maybe if I start with yourself, Mr. Whelan.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think if you look at the plan for rail, the plan for rail actually talks about having less fragmentation. And if you actually look at the bill, it actually opens the door to more fragmentation. So in an interoperable railway, surely the less interactions you have and the more interoperable you are, the better it is. Also, then the more interoperable you are, then the better value you get for cost, because the less changes you have, the less crew you have, the less all the other things that come with the duplication of what we currently do. So I see nothing in the bill that actually reduces costs. And as I said earlier, every 12 months we've got to give a report on how much more private sector opportunities we've had, but we don't have the same thing for the public sector or the growth of freight or other models, maybe concession models, because we still have those within the system as well.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to say what you should do to make it more palatable, because I don't like it. I mean, the best way to do it is have a general election and put both versions to the public and see which one they prefer. There's a democratic solution. But if one suggestion we would make is the prohibition of public sector operator, because you've already got them. The model is so broken, we've had to take, 5 under the Office of Operator of Last Resort. We've got 2 ScotRail franchises that are public ownership and 1 in Wales. So, and most people across the spectrum would say they're working better and people are more satisfied with those operators. I don't understand why this legislation would say to run a public sector operator. I mean, if you were going to say, let's compare the West Coast with the East Coast, very, direct, and you might do with a regional railway. Let's see what's best. Why would you prohibit that in the legislation? And that's a suggestion I make on the terms that's in there. I don't understand that provision, that you can't do it at all.
Okay. And to yourself, Mr. Lynch, and I think you've also said that the IRB would only theoretically be in charge of contracts, and the Secretary of State would effectively remain in day-to-day control. How would you change the bill to change that?
Well, if you're going to leave the IRB to commission, whether they're passenger service contracts, concessions, direct awards, whatever and that's not clear to us, and maybe it'll be a mixture. I think it should be the railway people, the industry leaders and the industry experts that should commission those services so that they fit with everything else that they're doing. There is a danger that you say, well, this contract's going to operate like this, but there's another one over there that's going to operate in a different way. And there have been problems, legal challenges, even from the private sector operators during privatisation, that the awards are changing. And there was an issue with Stagecoach when they bid for the West Coast. That's quite technical, but I think it should be down to the railway to decide how these commissioning activities are done, and not by a politician. I think that's the worst of both worlds. And that's not a dig at a party, because if this is going to be in for 30 years, you'll have all that lobbying of what's this contract going to be like directly via bodies like this and directly to individual MPs and ministers and all the rest of it. I don't think that's appropriate.
Mr. Whelan, do you want to add anything to that?
That's quite right. I mean, if it's going to be an independent body, it has to be an independent body, it has the authority to do it. And, you know, how often that gets reviewed and how those outputs get tested, that's the real debate, isn't it? Is the guiding mind working? Do we need to change the guiding mind? Do we need to change the emphasis? But you have to at least allow it. I mean, traditionally we go from Parliament to Parliament in our decisions, and quite obviously that doesn't work for major infrastructure. It doesn't work for the security of the industry. And we now find after a major pandemic we have to very much change the way in which we're looking at our industry.
Okay. Just on a slightly different but linked subject, in terms of franchising as a whole, I'm a North East politician, and we've just got a new North East mayor who's talking about franchising the bus systems. Is there anything different in the way that the buses are being franchised compared to the trains that one can learn from the other, or are you against franchising in both models anyway?
Well, we know the deregulation of buses took 1 million bus journeys out of the transport system, which directly impacted then about getting the growth footfall back on the railway system, because unfortunately for us, train stations don't move. They're either in the centre of town or central town, and the data tells us that people start their journeys in public transport, they finish them in public transport. So I'm not a fan of franchising in any transport. What we should be looking at, what we've never managed to do in the last 2.5 decades, is that most of the train operating companies have actually been run by bus companies, yet we failed to build any form of integrated transport into place where buses meet trains and encourage people to grow in that sector and grow the footfall in the way we should.
And of course the Bus Act, which this government put through, made municipal ownership of bus companies illegal, deliberately, because it was just ideological. So somewhere like the North East, the election that I was observing, a lot of people were saying we need a total transport network or an integrated network to revive the economy. The best way to do that would be through direct control, I believe. But as an alternative, they're having to say that franchising, which at least allows you to do more specifications tightly, which is happening in London and other places. But I think most of the mayors and the authorities would want direct control and operation of bus companies. Not all of them, but it depends on their views.
I don't disagree that something needs to improve in the buses in the North East, whether that's the right method or not, but a different thing. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Zara.
Thanks, Chair. Mr Lynch, in your written submission to the committee, you stated some concern around Transport Focus's ability to be able to represent passengers. Can you just expand on that, if possible, please?
Well, most people would say that it's an independent body and it's the passengers' voice. And I'm not having a go at the people. The people are very fine and experienced advocates for public transport and for the passenger, but it's not democratic. So if the funding is coming in the way it's coming and it's set up with the remit it's set up, its powers are too circumscribed. In the recent stations campaign, it couldn't really give voice to what people were saying. It had to just almost passively take all these lobbying activities, which included my union and lots of stuff, and almost passively sit there and wait till it was all concluded rather than getting involved as a voice of the user and the communities. I think that's got to change. I think they've got to have a remit that's more robust, allows them to be more intelligent and interventionist in the way that you'd expect an advocate of the passenger, and maybe it's got a wider voice than that if there's going to be a climate aspect to that and what communities think about public transport. It's just got to be differently exercised. It's too prescribed in what they can do, and it's too passive. It's described as a non-departmental public body sponsored by the DfT. I think most people say, well, what does that mean? You know, is it our voice or is it something that's put up by the DfT? I think it's just got to be a bit more usable for the everyday punter, user and community, because you may not always use the railway. It's not all commuters, and commuters often get a strong voice. There's lots of other people that use railways and buses seasonally, intermittently, and they've got to have a voice as well. Some of those things are designed up as the voice of the commuter traditionally, and it's not always the way it should be.
So what would you then want to see on the face of the bill so that Transport Focus can better represent people that are using the railway system?
Well, a democratic structure where people are elected or at least put there by passengers so that they're real advocates for what's going on. There are loads of community groups that are out there, and we found an awful lot of them in the ticket office campaign, and people who are really, really interested in transport and its interplay with all sorts of social activities. They've got to have a means of getting there. If you want to be the head of Transport Focus now, you're likely to be an industry insider. And again, I'm not denigrating those people in any way. It's just that the way it works, you've probably got to be one of those to work out how these mechanisms work. Whereas what's portrayed to the public is it's some kind of public democratic body. So there's got to be some form of democracy, but with a mixture of professionalism as well. You do need people who know what they're doing about this. But it's got to be some democracy hardwired into it.
Do you have anything to add, Mr. Whelan?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen from recent experience that the voice of disabled passengers very much got lost. It came to the fore in the ticket office dispute, and if you look back through recent annual Transport Focus reports, they mention it, but not to the extent of how much of a problem it is. Or even they didn't have the right to scrutinise the outputs or the figures of the various operating companies in relation to what they were claiming on how many passenger journeys they were doing. And we've seen more recently that there's an allegation some of these companies have been falsifying their figures. So how good can the scrutiny be if people don't have the independent authority to actually test what they're being told?
Thank you. Great.
Thanks, Chair. Well, good afternoon, gentlemen.
Afternoon.
I was just thinking about some of the other major restructures we've had and whether there's any lessons to be drawn from it. And I was thinking back to 2012 when we had the Health and Social Care Bill. Do you remember Simon Burns was the minister at the time? And he introduced something called the NHS mandate. Now, I don't know what involvement other stakeholders have in determining the mandate, but that was supposed to be the mechanism. Do you see any analogy with what's happening here with the Integrated Rail Board and their business plan? And would you have any involvement in setting the priorities, the yardsticks to judge performance?
We get the opportunity now to sit in various quangos and look at some of the industry figures that come out and question them and see how they're delivered and what's done. We get a slight opportunity via the ORR to sit down and look at the control periods for Network Rail, what they aren't doing or what they haven't achieved in previous control periods. I don't see anything with this bill that gives us any degree of opportunity or scrutiny at all to comment.
Yeah, it is a peculiarity since privatisation. There is not the railway. A lot of people, the British public think the railway is still there. There is no industry-wide forum where me and Mick and others go and meet the bigwigs, the top people. The only time we did get to do it is at the railway pension scheme because it's the last thing that, with the 104 sections. So it's a really weird situation, and it doesn't correct this. You'd think there'd be an industry forum every year, some kind of conference and dialogue, round tables, but there aren't. It's really weird. We have to arrange these things, sometimes illicitly, to go and even speak to chief execs because there's no structure in our railway. So the best voice we have are meetings like this, where we get to actually say, this is how we'd like the railway to run. You may not agree with us, but you at least some people have heard what we've got to say. So we have to go and arrange to have a pint with people every now and again to say, don't you think the railway should operate like this? It's a very peculiar situation that we don't set down that there should be an industry forum. So there's maybe people don't want national bargaining, but there's not even national consultation or a national forum. It's really strange. But that applies, as a colleague there was saying, that the public don't get that either. The public can't go to a biannual meeting and say, this is what it's all about, a conference on rail, what are the communities to do, what are villages supposed to do to get their input. It just doesn't exist, which is peculiar, in my opinion.
Earlier on, when we started the pre-leg scrutiny, ministers were telling us the purpose of this is to end fragmentation between track and train operating companies to reduce costs, to improve performance. But isn't it odd that the workforce aren't represented at the top table? Because I know both of you have strong views about the costs associated with the Roscoes, for example, and how we might look at organising things in a different way that secures a steady stream of work in the supply chain and provides better value for money for taxpayers.
There's also a more logistical aspect to this, if I might, is we forever see the Network Rail regions, areas, or whether being cast by route or other means, and that keeps changing. Well, none of that actually marries up to the railways in the areas which they're operating over. So we struggle sometimes to see how these alleged synergies are going to happen that are going to give these cost savings. You know, if the guiding mind is going to continue having the framework that they've currently got and regional directors who are looking after elements where there may be crossover from the various operators or sections of the railway, whether it be freight or whatever, how then does that work to us? The only time that we've ever seen anything on performance rather than cost work is when they've had joint controls between certain operators and Network Rail, whereas was trialled in ScotRail and on South Western in the past. But how any of this then translate into actual how do we get better savings for the industry? If you can have a multitude of new privateers and more fragmentation as a possible consequence of this bill, how does that then, having the guide in mind, give you a cost saving? I don't see it. I wish someone could explain it to me.
Can I just ask you one more thing from here? You raise it in the evidence, Mick, Whelan. That's in relation to the IRB requiring to produce an annual report about increasing private sector rail involvement in the railway. And you say in your evidence that's a contradiction to the plan for rail. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think it is a contradiction?
We see that more as a political or an ideological point. If we're not going to look at, as has been discussed before, the transparency and how we measure the outputs and what's being done, but we are very much going to measure the success of the future railway against how many more private open access companies we can get into the railway, we see that the plan for rail is being subverted by the actual bill itself.
Would it be amended to better reflect our desire to improve services and deliver the improvements everyone wants to see without scrapping it entirely?
Again, I think you've mentioned my last preference. I think the difficulty with this is we are very much assuming that everything that is translates over. And then we're going to bolt on what happens in future. Now, I see nothing in the existing control periods that allows for the further fragmentation of what we're going to do or how it's going to operate. I see nothing in how the licensing, and if you were to look at open access, where we both have members, right, the issue is open access is bespoke. You go Hull to London, you go Hartlepool to London, you go to where New Stirling to London service is going to be introduced. You're not actually looking for volume for mass transit, and it's the volume of mass transit that gives you those economies that possibly gives you the opportunity to reduce fares or to cross-subsidise. And I see nothing in that area that promotes that.
Yeah, which is why Elizabeth Line's been so successful, because it's integrated with the rest of London transport, physically and operationally. But the fragmentation point, Graham, that you were putting, because we've had more, it's not just fragmentation on rail, we've had fragmentation with rolling stock, procurement and manufacturing, and all of this year we've had crisis at Derby, crisis at Newton Aycliffe, and the new Spanish manufacturers, Talgo and CAF, will have their problems. And if we don't have a single entity and guide in mind that has actually got a plan, as Mick said, maybe 30 years would be great, but we don't seem to have a plan to the end of this year about how we asked Siemens and Hitachi and Talgo and CAF to come over and invest, and they seem to be keen. We've got one in South Wales, we've got some in the north of England. Talgo were looking to go into the east of Scotland, which would have been great, you know, because you've got every nation involved. They must be sitting there thinking, well, why would I want to go there? They can't even work out how the railway's going to be operated, who's going to own it, what the plan is. Because every manufacturer will say, I need to keep this unit open. It's got to have a steady flow of work. And every business person would tell you that. I can't invest if I'm not going to get any return. And then, of course, we've got this strange model where we put Roscoe's in between and say, let's give you all of our money, and then you go off and find these manufacturers. And I thought, well, they're in Newton Aycliffe. Yeah. They're up in Derby. There's one in South Wales. We were going to get one in Scotland. Why can't we just talk to them and get the best deal we can? And surely that's the railway we want. I don't know. We just keep putting lawyers, accountants, and offshore tax havens in the way of reviving manufacturing and reviving our railway. This bill will do nothing about that at all. It's inadequate in that sense.
Also, if I might, Chair, there's nothing within the bill that talks about social impact. We are still one of the few countries that doesn't look at our supply chains. So if you go to Germany, you see German trains, if you go to Italy, you see Italian trains or whatever. It's not because they're being xenophobic. It's before they award a government contract, they look at their supply chains, future apprenticeships, and all the things associated with those contracts and damage it does. And I see nothing within this bill that drives us, particularly in rail procurement, either for infrastructure or for trains, that takes that as a consideration.
Gavin, you wanted to come in.
Thanks so much, Chair. We'll just pick up that last point that Mr Whelan mentioned on social impact. Clearly we see that situation within the bus manufacturing sector as well, which may or may not come up on Thursday at transport questions. But whilst we're on Roscoe's, and clearly we've got a next panel discussing Roscoe's in more detail, I think your evidence thus far has been fairly clear in terms of what you think about Roscoe's. I wonder if you could elaborate on what your view is, because clearly, to your point earlier, Mr Lynch, we've got two distinct plans for the future of rail, certainly south of the border, but both still make room for Roscoe's. So what's your thoughts on that? I'll start with you, Mr Whelan, because...
Well, I think the real problem here is that you can only procure from the specialist operators that are out there. Now, I'd hope that sometime in the future, if we procure trains and we pay for them, they stay in the public purse. We could use possibly Merseyrail as the model, where they've bought their own trains, because it's the longevity of future trains that actually give you the value back to the public purse. So you buy the trains, and as I understand from some of the figures, you see after 7 years that you've paid back what you've invested, and for the next 50 they're yours and you get the returns upon them. Surely that should be more weighted to the people that are paying for those trains initially and using them, and it's got to be a better way of doing it. And what we seem to be enshrining here is that we're going to use what's there.
Yeah, I think there's no space for Roscoe's. I don't think they need to exist. They're undesirable, and I think they're an obstacle to the development of the railway. They're only there because of the ideology of privatisation and franchising. If you take Eurostar, which is a private business technically, they went direct to Siemens and bought their trains, and they got a good deal, and they're a major asset to that company. And without giving away too much of their business, during the trough of COVID, when they had no passengers, weren't allowed passengers, it was the fact that they owned their trains that saved that business. Now, that didn't affect any of the train operating companies, didn't affect the Roscoe's. They got paid every single penny that they were due as dividend and as profit, whereas a company like Eurostar had to survive on its own merits. I just don't understand why Roscoe's are even contemplated as a part of our railway.
It's a percentage of operating costs this year compared to last year. How much are leasing charges now compared to last year?
Isn't it saying they've gone up by 40%? 40% increase. But we can get you an answer to that.
The charges may not have gone up by 40%, we don't mislead you. The profits have gone up by 40%. So, but I don't believe the charges have gone down.
Sorry, Greg, can you like Gavin?
You jump in.
Come back to you at the end.
We can redirect the witness after this question, Graham. But given that, do you have any idea why? Because Labour's plan for rail is certainly a lot closer to Scottish Government's and SNP's plans for rail. Any idea why Labour have continued with Roscoe's in their plan?
Yes, unfortunately. The model being proposed under the other GBR is taking the railway back at zero cost. And unfortunately, the one part of it that you couldn't take back at zero cost with the Roscoe's because A, the litigation, and B, the high cost.
A barrage of lawyers would, and you'd have to pay them out at full cost. That's the great design of the privatised railway. You can't even get out of it if it's undesirable. That's what we've been burdened with.
We know how big a fan you are of lawyers, Mr Lynch, but you also have issues in terms of Luxembourg Protocol and how that might apply. Might it, with the current arrangements in place, with Roscoe's in place, if we're looking ahead, if Roscoe's weren't part of the picture and we could join, Luxembourg Protocol was signed and we were to use Eurofema or etc. and procure cheaper rolling stock for the public purse, would that not be welcome?
Also be welcome, and also the biggest problem of the last 2 decades has been that we've targeted most of our investment where the highest footfall is, which is in and around the southeast. And then we targeted most of the new trains in and around the southeast, and we've actually created a cast-off situation. So every time there's a new train set in the southeast, we cascade trains to elsewhere. So, and generally, we've got other parts of the country that are grateful for things that are already 20 years old. I think we need a more arching global strategy for one traction, possibly in some future an electrified railway where everybody's on the same standard of train, and you vary the train by the needs of the commuters by length rather than by design. And I understand the need for competition, but it's no reason why you can't have two or even a public operator producing the same train. The fact that we have this multitude of different trains has probably been very good for my members, because they keep having to learn new traction, new bits and pieces, and getting paid for it. But at the end of the day, it's not the best way to run a railway.
Yeah, I mean, with respect, we wouldn't mind an integrated industrial policy and an economic policy. We say, what's the best advice to the people? We used to make all of our trains. British Rail Engineering made every single train and every wagon and coach on the railway. So that meant places like Glasgow, Doncaster, Crewe had a lifetime of work, but we deliberately closed it down. Now we have to ask foreign overseas manufacturers to do us a favour and come here and bring some jobs. So it's all gone completely pear-shaped, but we could start with removing Roscoe's, because even if you favour private manufacturers, and to be fair, they've got to compete, they've got to make a decent product, why don't we just ask them to do it, and then we can maybe sort some of these problems out.
I look forward to Evans and the next panel on the back of this, but very quickly, minimum service levels, do you think there's a danger that they might be applied by GBR, well, presumably GBR, rather than as they would be or might be the current situation by individual operators once a new body comes in? Obviously, the ScotRail and others have said that they wouldn't do so.
We have views, and we have made representations to all the safety bodies jointly and separately about minimum service levels, and nobody's been able to tell us how they can be operated safely. And that's one of the major factors within it. The way the legislation is currently written, one operator came to me and said it would take 90% of staff to run 40% service, and then I'd have no service the next day. Forced labour of any kind is a stain on the character of this democracy and this country, and is wrong. That's a personal opinion. No one has to agree with me.
I don't want to go into debate on minimum service levels,
but the reality is, look, if the integrated operator felt they could do it safely, we would have to comply with the legislation.
Is there a danger that the IRB could apply that across the network rather than allow it to operators? Is that your understanding of the situation?
I think what you're then saying is that you would have a national stripe across the network all the time, rather than localised stripe on the occasion that you get with a private operator. That's an interesting concept for us.
It's possible. I mean, but it's still, we have not had a dispute with Network Rail yet. We've had disputes with train operating companies, both unions, and there's been no hint that they're going to do it, because they told this body that it wouldn't work, some of the operators. But we'd have to see with Network Rail. But theoretically, it could be imposed on us, but we would see how we would refuse to comply.
Yeah, I've taken this down a siding chair, but my last question on other puns are available, and the ORR, in terms of the new role and function, if you want to put it like that, of ORR following implementation of GBR. And in fact, I'm struck by the RMT submission. So this is likely to see the ORR pulled between granting open access in the name of a chimerical competition and operating to defend the interests of the handful of monopolistic companies functioning as rentier capitalists on Britain's passenger services. I'm saying that because that's possibly one of the best sentences I've seen in evidence that's been sent to this committee. But why do you think, I'll start with you, Mr Lynch, why the ORR might find it difficult to exercise its competition duty?
Well, I just think it's a confused body now, and I think it'd be even more confused if there is a national railway and there's still the ORR promoting licences for independent private sector operation. I just don't. The thrust of nearly everyone, of all persuasions, is we need an integrated and to a certain extent planned railway that's working for everyone. And then you just throw in another body, the ORR, saying, well, I'm going to give a licence to this niche operator to, I don't want to use the word parasite, but operate on the back of what everyone else is doing to integrate, drive down costs, get efficiency, keep people happier. But then we're just going to open up this other separate railway. You know, if you did that on the tube, every 5th train is going to be a private sector operator. You go, well, what we wanted was a train every 2 minutes. I don't know why you'd want to throw that into the national railway. What you want is a railway that works for people, where we understand the pricing, we understand who's accountable for delivery. And they've got this other role they're meant to be the safety inspector, but they award the contracts to the employers and they promote competition. And I think they should get on with being an inspectorate for safety, looking at regulation where it's appropriate, pressing the entity, which will be GBR, as an inspectorate, but also as an ombudsman or whatever powers they're given. I don't know. It's not at the top of our minds. But I just do know you can't bleed powers off to another body and expect the first body to be accountable. And the worst thing in this bill is the Secretary of State is also interfering. So the Secretary of State can go over to the ORR and say, I want you to push the new railway body that way. I can do it myself and poke them in the ribs this way. And they're thinking, we were told we've got to get on with running the railway. Now I've got all these other interventions. I just don't understand it. If they're an inspectorate, they're an inspectorate, and they should be given the powers to do it.
Last, Mr. Whelan, same question, but how would they exercise that competition duty whilst giving that due regard to the cost incurred by the taxpayer, which seems to have a slight conflict?
Right. The ORR has always been the one that looks at Network Rail in relation to how they spend their money, what budget they get, and whatever else. And we don't disagree with that oversight. We sometimes disagree with some of the conclusions, but there has to be oversight. It's not a problem for us. The independent regulator can't be having given preferential treatment to other bodies to fulfil a role within this bill. So, to the detriment of existing contractors, I'm now going to give this to somebody else because I've got to fulfil a requirement within this statute. That isn't a level playing field. That is inherently unfair. But as they're also the safety body, does that also import some sort of unconsidered risk? So I think it's wrong.
Okay, conscious of time, Chair.
Thank you. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the points that have been made about private involvement, because we have seen as a committee in other countries where we see much greater private investment going into not just running services, but also into the infrastructure. So Japan, for example, often a third of investment in infrastructure is from the private sector. So there is a less of a dependency on taxpayer money going in to pay for those costs. And obviously we're having to, the rail sector is having to compete with all other schools, hospitals, police and everything else. So how do we, with the changes which are proposed with Great British Railways and everything else, how do you see it that we could attract more investment from the private sector into rail in this country? Maybe Mr. Whelan, you want to start first?
Well, our experience is that the 3 tenets that John Major put forward never happened. Privatisation was going to drive competition. We know that didn't happen. Privatisation was going to drive investment. We know that didn't happen. Privatisation was going to drive innovation. There's nothing in this bill that encouraged anybody to build 1 inch of track. There's nothing within this bill, right, because the short-termism of the way open access works, if you get a 10 or 15-year contract, that would encourage you to build a train. You'd lease, buy, or get them from some other party. There's nothing I see within this bill that actually encouraged private investment. The whole model has basically been for years that, other than Chiltern, I won't mislead anybody, in the early days, right, that we've had no private investment in our railways for the last 23 years. It's all come centrally. And this, again, will only encourage privateers to come into an already set up infrastructure to see if they can run trains within it. There's nothing in here that actually will drive the investment that you'd like to see.
How has that been possible in other countries, not just Japan, in other parts of Europe? We're seeing an increasing involvement of the private sector. How has it happened in those countries, but it's not happened here?
Because the only line I think that we have had built would have been HS1, which is currently owned by a Canadian Teachers' Pension Fund, the last time I looked. Once that was done and dusted, we did everything we could, including taking out a link from HS2 into HS1 to deter anybody building any further railways for that connectivity. We don't have the geographical space they have in other countries where we got the room to build railways at a reasonable cost. So it's not attractive to come in and build a new line anywhere. or to put an old line in place. We don't have the skill sets in the UK or the supply chains to do it either. So I think in elsewhere it's done because it can be done for relatively economic, on a relatively economic basis. We're getting a return that pays for the initial investment. In the UK we can't do that.
I think in Japan, I'm told that much of the capital that comes is because of property development associated with track enhancement. So the developers get real bang for their buck out of that. They want to make a shopping centre or a housing development, they build a railway to go with it, or refurbish the railway. I don't know if that's completely true, you may have more facts, but we have had private sector involvement, and it's under the Labour government, ironically. HS1 was meant to be built by a private operator, London and Continental Railways. It went bankrupt and had to be rescued. We built it for $7 billion of public sector money because the private sector failed. Then Mr Cameron sold it because he's such an astute businessman for $900 million. So he lost $6.1 billion on that. We had to rescue Tube Lines and Metronet, who came onto the tube. Another previous Labour government initiative. Ken Livingstone had to take all that back in-house. So where we've had private sector operation, they proved to be completely inept. They don't want to invest. They want to milk the railway and milk the taxpayer. And that's exactly what Roscoe's do and what all of the train operating companies have done whenever they've been asked to repay some of their franchise money. It's what the First Group did on Great Western. They threw the keys back and said, we'll never pay a penny back to the taxpayer. We were told that this would happen through privatisation. The lesson has been, as soon as it's got to come out of their pocket and they've got to put capital up front, they refuse to do it. I don't think they've ever invested any capital. They've never built a train. They've never built a station. They don't even pay for the uniforms on the staff back. They get that from the franchise arrangements. That's the failure that you're describing, private sector involvement.
In terms of, and you mentioned a minute ago that I think you described open access as parasitic, which I think is pretty distasteful, to be honest. But
why?
In terms of...
Why is it distasteful?
Well, what we've seen, and what, if you let me ask the question, is that actually open access operators have seen both passenger numbers and revenues return quicker than the rest of the system since the pandemic. So how would you reflect on that?
They're not paying the true cost of their operations, because they're not paying the true cost of operating the infrastructure, they're not paying the true cost of operating the stations, they're not paying for the signallers. It's an ideological...
People are voting with their feet. You know, people are, as I say, you know, passenger numbers, revenue numbers have returned quicker since pandemic. So surely passengers...
It's mainly because they're kind of new starts. I'm not saying that they haven't got a good business model, but it's in effect a cross-subsidised business model. If they'd had to pay their full costs of their start-ups compared to everyone else, that business model wouldn't operate. Why don't they just go out and build railways then and operate them from the start?
They don't do it, do they? I agree with you on that, but the reality is that in terms of those services, we are seeing people use them. People are increasingly so. So how does that...
Maybe that's because of the model that the rest of the railway's been hobbled with because of the privatisation model. If we had a properly integrated railway, we wouldn't need open access operators because we'd have an efficient fare system that delivered for all of the communities.
Don't you think there should be choice, not just in terms of...
People have always had choice. You can get the express train or the slow train, and that's pretty much what the model is with open access operators. They get certain preferential arrangements and paths, and they bid for those paths, which are often preferential to the one that the traditional operator is running.
Whelan, you wanted to...
I think I said in my earlier contribution, most open access is a bit niche. So they've got a captive audience from the certain location they go, and the mainline railways tend not to run any more trains there because they've got the operator. So there is less choice now. You either go by Grand Central, or you go by Hull trains, or you go by another, or you wait 2 hours for a train. So I think part of the reason it came back was there was a lack of opportunity and a lack of the choice you described.
I really just want to dig in a bit more into Jack's point. So very, very briefly, he was asking what, if anything, could be put on the face of this bill to attract the private investment. So is there anything that you can think of that could actually be incorporated into the bill that would attract it?
There's one area that we really haven't explored, and that's freight. So it's the current government's avowed view to double freight by 2050. We're fighting off redundancies across the freight sector is collapsing. And the only thing that's going to regenerate the freight sector is going to be massive infrastructure work. So if we were to invest in our infrastructure, whether it be railways, housings, hospitals, whatever, that kick-started the construction side of freight, right, and also left us with an asset, I think that would very much be one place where we could get people going. The only other model, of course, is the Hong Kong model, whereby you, as Mick described, you sell the railways to property speculators and they own the air above the stations, which works quite well in Hong Kong, but not quite sure would work in Skipton.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Freight is a Cinderella part of the railway. They're always looking for investment. I'm not certain that private sector freight operators who can run via road rather than rail will do anything without being incentivised. So one of the things that could come on the bill is that the Secretary of State must meet targets for the transfer of road freight onto rail freight. And that would mean that the independent body, GBR, whatever it's called, would have to create an environment where investment comes in to make that target happen. But I don't see that that's happening either. There's no particular requirement for anything to be achieved in terms of passenger numbers, extension of routes, lowering fares, or increasing freight on rail.
Thank you. I'm afraid time is against us. I'm sure we could continue the